Thank you so much, Jerry. For the reasons you've mentioned, this is the best possible introduction I could have had. And just to continue along the lines of what you say, trying to think together many different things that seemingly belong to many different fields is something that I did learn from one of the two people and mentors of mine that you have mentioned, Louis Althusser and Jacques Derrida. I remember having once presented to Derrida two totally different papers. One of them was an essay I wrote on Nietzsche, and the other one was an essay I wrote about questions of African philosophy. And his only comment was to tell me, Bashir, why don't you try to think them together? And that is what I've been trying to do, and just like you. And I'm still on the path of doing that. So thank you so much indeed for that very generous introduction. I would like to thank everybody who made my visit here possible. Thank you all first for coming, and thank you in particular to my good friend Sherif Diop and Professor Anne Richards for having asked me to come, which I accepted with all my heart, because it is quite an honor and a pleasure for me to be here. And I'm so glad in Bangkok that you could be here. Thank you for your presence. I must say that the fact that my talk is being given under the light that you just mentioned and that you also mentioned was not planned at all. I promise I did not ask that newspaper to write that. Just to over-dramatize the reflections I was going to give, or to spice up my presentation of Islamic perspectives on secularism, pluralism, and tolerance. Something else that I did not plan for, because this was decided many, many weeks ago over the phone, as Sherif mentioned earlier, and at that time, nothing was happening in Tunisia or Libya or Egypt or anywhere in the Middle East, unless we think that things are always happening in the Middle East anyway. But none of what we are witnessing today. So the light under which I was going to make that presentation on Islamic perspectives on pluralism, tolerance, and democracy has totally changed in the past days. So now I find myself having to speak to events that obviously were not on the map by then. So what is now known as the Arab Revolution or the Arab Spring not only had not happened yet by the time I said yes to this conference, but was not even foreseen, since, as we all know by now, the Tunisian Revolution, followed by the fall of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, the civil war in Libya, which is still going on and seems to be there for quite a while, and all the daily demonstrations in almost all Arab countries have caught everyone by surprise, including the actors themselves, who, as in all revolutions, feel that they are less the actors of the events than somehow the instruments of some idea that transcends them. I am making such a precision here because, of course, the events that I just mentioned now put my presentation under a totally different light, as I say, and I need to acknowledge that, since we can say that there is truly a before and an after the so-called Arab Revolution or Arab Spring. What does the before look like? Well, before, there was one main question about Muslim communities in general, especially after the terrorist attack of 9/11 had revealed to a horrified world the existence of killers intent on carrying mass killings and prepared to destroy, in the name of an ideology that they claim Islamic, everything that in their minds was Western, by which they understood not only Western people or Western interests or Western symbols, but also Westernized states and elites in Muslim societies or traditionally Muslim lands, as we have seen with the Algerian Civil War. I just want to remind you at the outset that the Algerian Civil War was a planned killing also of academics, journalists, writers, by people who thought that these were the true embodiment within Muslim lands of what they thought was Western. That big question, the before question, was that of the compatibility of Islam in general with modernity. Modernity understood as the result of the process of secularization, which has been admirably described in my colleague and friend Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. Modernity understood as pluralism, that is the capacity to accept, or better, to respect diversity. Modernity understood also as democracy. The question, that before question, becomes even more urgent because of the Muslim communities living now in the West, in Europe, or North America in particular. When I say now, I mean in the past decades, because if you take Europe, for example, the waves of immigrants coming from Muslim societies have been very important in the past few decades, and in very large numbers as well. The question can be formulated as follows. Can these Muslim communities get really integrated in the West? And there is the group of those who believe in the separation of cultures, who believe that identities are destinies. And here I am I'm paraphrasing the title of Amartya Sen's book titled Identity and Violence, Identity and Destiny, where he shows that the belief that an identity in a very unique way traces a path for me is fundamentally violence. So these people would be believing in the inevitable clash of cultures and consider that intolerance, often accompanied by violence against other beliefs, not to mention disbelief, is in the very essence of Islam. The Muslim religion, they claim, cannot essentially be pluralistic, and for that reason, Muslim immigrants in particular cannot be truly integrated within secular Western societies, as long that is, as they pretend to retain their Muslim identities. So we see it in Europe, much less in this country, which is more used to the term, but we see in Europe, who have witnessed these rapid growth in Muslim immigrants in the past decades. We witnessed the discourse saying that multiculturalism is either impossible or has failed. Multiculturalism is now in question in France, in Germany, or in England. And recently, German Chancellor, the British Prime Minister, and of course the French President, who is so preoccupied with French identity, and who is launching a debate on Islam et laïcité, Islam and secularism. All of these three leaders have all raised the issue of the viability of multiculturalism when it comes to Muslim communities. At one point there was a talk about the possibility of creating what was labeled Euro-Islam, a truly European Islam, now more and more leaders are declaring that impossible. While scholars actually, especially a scholar like G.T. Clausen, who has written a wonderful book titled The Islamic Challenge, Politics and Religion in Western Europe, has proven the contrary. In other words, when leaders talk about essences, they talk about general terms, Islam on the one hand, modernity on the other hand, and tries to match them together, they are just talking about concepts. When people, scholars, do the work on the ground, just look at the Muslim communities living where they live and asking the right questions, they find out that what is being said politically is radically different from what they witness on the ground, and how these people actually get integrated far more easily than the political discourse is pretending they are. That would be the before. Now there is an after the so-called Arab Spring. Of course, when I say after, it happened just a couple or 3 weeks ago. So it is way too early to tell how things are going to turn out. But the very fact that these events have just taken place the way they have has already changed the terms of the issue. Let me simply quote here 2 columns published recently in the New York Times, one by Nicholas Christoph, one by conservative columnist David Brooks. This was in early March 2011, while the events were happening. The point made by Christoph, commenting on the work of Timur Kuran, an economic historian from Duke University, is that the acceleration of history that we are witnessing in this Arab Spring simply destroys the essentialist view of an immutable Muslim world, petrified, so to say, in an epoch and a worldview radically irreconcilable with modernity. David Brooks, in his column, underlines the fact that the events in North Africa and the Middle East prove Huntington's view that Islam is defined by essential traits that inevitably conflict with the West and the modernity it represents, simply wrong. To quote David Brooks, we have seen the peoples willing to risk their lives for pluralism, openness, and democracy, end of quote. All aspirations that have been said by some to be foreign to the Muslim mind and spirit.